Hello makers, and welcome to Share Stitchery. I'm Catherine Harris, and I do sewing and DIY tutorials each week. This week is a special week because I decided to do a collab with my dear friend Curtis from Not Handsome But Handy, as he is doing a DIY project on how to overhaul your RV. And I decided that I would help him out by making some curtains for him and his RV. And I thought I would share my process on how to make curtains for little tiny windows in your RV. So let's get to it.
Bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum.
Going to begin with cutting the pieces for the curtains. So you're going to want to cut 2 rectangles per curtain rod so it opens up nicely. For the width, you're going to do either 1.5 to 2 times the width of the window for the main fabric to create that fullness for you. And then on the length, you're going to do 4 1/4 inches longer than the desired length so you have that nice upturn at the bottom. Now for the lining pieces, you're going to maintain that same 1.5 or 2 times the width of the window, whichever you chose, less 2 inches for the lining. And so here I am just measuring out the pieces that I'm going to cut. I am using a water-soluble marker, making a couple of markings along the fabric and then cutting through a single layer of fabric using my quilting ruler so that I get nice straight cuts and know that everything is even, because you will be able to tell on curtains. So next we're going to go on to the ties. So for this particular one, I decided to do up some ties, and you can just play around with whatever measurements work for what you're doing. I have mine 4 inches wide and about 16 inches long. And I'm just pinning it right sides together, and then I'm going to stitch along the top to create a tube. And I'm doing the end of one piece that I'm stitching along. I've clipped the corner, and then I'm going to flip that tube right side out. So you just pull through, and when you have something that's about 4 inches wide, it's pretty easy to get that out. Now to make the corners a little bit more precise, I am going to use my wooden point turner, and I'm going to point those corners out nicely before I give it a nice good press with the iron. And you want to use a decent amount of steam on that so that it's nice and crisp. So the next thing that you are going to do once you get that all nice and steamed is to fold over the ends on that open end of those ties. And you want to get them so that they're sitting nicely together. And then you're going to give that a nice good press. And by using some steam, you get a nice crisp edge. You won't even need to pin it when you take it over to your sewing machine to stitch that in. Now you can do it by hand, and it's going to give a more seamless result, but these are going to be on the back of the curtains, so I figured you can just stitch right on down them. And you can see here I am doing this for my dear friend, and he has got quite a few windows in his camper here. So these are all the ties that I am going to do up. So once you've got them done, I decided to do Velcro because it's a lot easier. You're going to place one end on one side and then the other end on the other side so that they stick together nicely, just like so. And I stitch that on using a box stitch, and it shall hold securely. And here are all the pieces that I've done up for him. And now that that's done, we are going to line the curtains. So the way that we're going to start is we're going to take those 2 pieces. And so you'll notice that I have about 1 inch extra on either end of that. So we're going to match them up with right sides together, and we're going to match up those side seams. So the ones that are going to be vertical going down. So not the top and the bottom where the rod goes and where it touches the floor, but those side seams there. So we are just going to pin those in place, and they will not match up on either sides because we have our lining pieces slightly shorter than our outside main fabric panels, but that is for a reason. So we're just going to stitch along there. Once it's done being stitched, I'm just flipping it right side out so it's easier for you to see what I'm doing here, but you don't necessarily need to flip it right side out. I'm matching up the two seams that we had just stitched and marking the middle pieces on the lining, which is my white, and on our main curtain fabric so that I have the exact middle. Then I'm going to flip it back so it's right sides together, and I'm going to match up those two center pieces. And there's going to be an overlap. Now with this, I wasn't able to make as much of an overlap as I would have liked because I was working with some budget fabric that I had found on discount. Yay, but there wasn't as much of it available. So I have a slightly less of an overlap. It's about 1/2 inch as opposed to 1 inch on either end. But when we flip it right side out after stitching the top portion, you can see that on the sides, you've got our main fabric rolled to the back. And so that is exactly what we want to have for our curtains. It creates a nice crisp layer for our curtains. So now we are just going to press it to make sure all of the edges are nice and crisp. And I know if you're working with larger panels, it can take some time, but by all means do press it. It really makes a big difference. And go and get the middle of the curtain as well as you're pressing it to get rid of all of the wrinkles. There we are. Now for the rod casing. So you can make the rod casing out of lining fabric, which I've used, or out of your main curtain fabric. And it's a separate rectangle, which is the length of your curtain panel once it is finished sewing, minus what you're rolling over for your hem on either side, so that when it matches up perfectly with that lining piece. So I've just stitched the edges there in place, and then I'm going to fold that right sides together, and I'm going to create a tube and stitch along the long edge and then pull that out so we have a nice casing for you to put your rod in. Now, if you're going to be using a larger rod, by all means make this casing larger. This one's a camper one, so I didn't expect a very big rod to go in there. Now you're going to stitch the top and the bottom of that casing so that you can fit your rod on. Now for the hemming of the bottom of the curtains. So you're going to measure how far you want those hems to be, and as you're doing some stitching, some things might come out of place just slightly. So I'm just trimming that up and making sure that everything is true, and then I am rolling it over. Now, I had mentioned 4 1/4 is the perfect amount, so if you're doing that, you will measure 2 inches of hem, and you'll do that as a double fold, and it creates a very nice hem. As these are camper curtains and I wasn't working with a lot of fabric, I am doing a more narrow hem on that end. So number 1, it was stylistic because I think it looks a little bit better in a camper that way. And number 2, it saved on fabric, therefore reducing the cost of what it was going to cost to make that. And once that's all done, you press them nicely and your curtain is all ready to be hung up in your camper. Now you know how to make your very own curtains for your camper, or you could extrapolate that and make curtains for your house as well. If you have any questions or any ideas on something else I should make, let me know in the description down below. And don't forget to check out my dear friend Curtis's video. I will leave a link in the description as well as a card up here. Until next time, makers, let's get our Sew-Spiration on.